A lot of times when we make decisions in our life, we use the comparison to what we think it should be. And in reality, that might not be the best thing to do.
Welcome back to WizNugs. Today, we're talking about the age-old question, compared to what? So, as mentioned in the intro, sometimes we're making choices, and we get in our heads that something has to be a certain way, that, well, I can't take that job because it's not perfect, or I don't really want that car because it doesn't have all of these other features that all new cars have now. So one way around that is to ask ourselves, compared to what? So when we're making these choices, we can say, do I need to compare to the perfect state, best possible option? Or can I compare it to where I'm at now? And is this an improvement?
So, on that note, I think a lot of times in our lives, and I think I've been guilty of this as well, is that we have the ideal situation form of what we want something to be, right? If it's a decision to do something, or if it's a job, if it's a car, possession, something of that nature, and we juxtapose it to the ideal state.
Well, that's kind of drilled into the system in a certain sense. Like I remember I have studied economics, and I love it. We did a whole video on it. I'm not going to go too deep down that rabbit hole.
Sure.
But I think it's worth pointing out that's built into the inherent study of economics these days. There's this thing that they call perfect competition.
Okay.
And I don't mean to belabor the whole point here, but the gist of it is, if you take a system, you take capitalism to its logical extreme.
Okay.
There's zero barriers to entry. So if you want to start a company, it costs you nothing to do. You don't have to worry about buying equipment or packaging or factories or whatever. Also, everybody has perfect knowledge. So you know what prices are going to be tomorrow, so you can set your prices today accordingly.
Right.
It assumes all of these things, that there's a potentially infinite number of suppliers of any given good or service, so that prices are completely stable all the time. Well, that's not reality. That's not how things are. So in this concept, we're looking at perfect competition and then looking at the real world and saying, oh, the real world does not measure up to perfect competition. Therefore, we need antitrust litigation to be able to break up large companies because it's not in the public interest, because it differs from this perfect competition model. And a lot of things end up changing for basically no reason other than, well, it's not utopia and I don't want it.
Right. And the only way it's really considered to be acceptable is if it's as close to utopian as we can get it. And the reality is that's not even feasible, because there's so many unknowns.
Utopia literally means nowhere. It's a place that doesn't exist and can't exist.
Right.
But it's become this shorthand over, I would love to look up those references,
Right.
To mean the perfect place. And it's true that they both are the same thing. The
Yeah,
perfect
really, in
place
essence,
doesn't
they mean
exist.
the exact same thing. It's an unreal place. It doesn't exist. So given that, then we have to say, well, what do we actually want to compare things to in order to make decisions in our life? Could we compare it to the best possible scenario we have experienced? I mean, that might be fair to a point. But then you also have to take in the other extremities or the other conditions that are going on at that time in order to consider, well, can I really juxtapose this to the best thing I've ever had? You mentioned earlier, we talked about you going to a restaurant.
So on that, I took a road trip recently,
Right.
and we're going through small town on the side of the highway. And it was one of these situations where, okay, so in this case, I decided I'm going to look up on TripAdvisor, got my smartphone out, pulled up the app, I go TripAdvisor, and I go, okay, what's the best rated restaurant in this little town?
Right.
And, as you can imagine, it's not like a 5-star place.
Sure.
But we looked at the top 3 or 4, and as a group made a decision about where we thought would be a cool place to go. Most of these places were pretty good. But again, you have to ask yourself, compared to what? Because if I stop and I say, is this the best restaurant experience I've ever had? No, absolutely not. Falls short. It is, it was just food. But if you compare it to what are my other options in this little town, or how would I feel about this as compared to stopping at, say, McDonald's or some other fast food that's just, it's a small town fast food place.
Or a side of the road a gas station sandwich. Right?
Right. Or the roller grill hot dogs.
Right.
Those are always, if you compare it to one of those things, it's amazing.
Right.
And it all depends, right? And so you can make yourself miserable by comparing the options that are in front of you to some magical, mythical, perfect option that you don't even really have in your situation.
And that applies not only to food, this applies to situations that you're in your life. And so what I mean by that is, if something's going on in your life and it's not optimal, you can take the view of where I'm going to compare it to where I want to be or the perfect place, and I'm going to be upset and distraught and disappointed, and that's what I'm going to focus on, is these negative feelings. Or am I going to say, well, it's not, gas station hot dogs, and say, well, I'm not going to be upset about this. Yes, it's not this, but it's definitely not that. And so I'm going to be grateful. I'm going to be grateful that this is what I have right now. Could it be better? Yes. Can I do things to make it better? Let me see. Maybe. So let me do those things to make it better. But I'm not going to be upset in the moment because it's not exactly perfect, which doesn't exist.
Here's another example. We're watching a movie and main character takes his shirt off. And he's got abs of steel and muscles in places that, like, I didn't even know had muscles. It would be really easy, and sometimes I do this, to stop and look at that and go, wow, I wish I looked like that. That would be amazing. I watched a video talking about, like, a personal trainer and his experiences. Like, people come in and they say, I have this picture in my mind that I want to look like. And he goes, let me guess, Brad Pitt from Fight Club. How did you know?
Right.
Everybody since that movie came out has wanted to look like Brad Pitt in Fight Club. That's the utopia. That's the ideal. But the reality is, in order to do that, he had to be ridiculously dehydrated on that day to be able to get that definition. And this is after training and eating nothing but like, what is it? Chicken breast and broccoli. And that's all you can eat for 6 months to get in that kind of shape. Only for the movie.
And that was his job. That was his focus. I don't have to do anything else. I'm going to get up. I'm going to have my personal chef prepare the food that I needed to be able to get into the shape and maintain it. Then my trainer is going to come over and we're going to go from here to the gym and we're going to do all these exercises. And my entire day for this movie, while I'm filming it, is to get into and maintain this shape. This is my job. This is what I'm getting paid to do. I don't have to worry about who's taking care of the kids. I don't worry about making dinner. I don't have to worry about who's paying the bills. I don't have to worry about anything else. I have people who handle all those things for me to get into this. And so when you see that movie and you're like, ooh, I want to look like that. Right, well, who's going to do all these other side things that I currently am responsible for? Who's going to do that? Oh, well, I don't have anyone. Well, then I guess I'm not going to do it because I can't have the perfect situation.
And conversely, you could easily look at, okay, well, I'm not on my 600-pound life.
Right.
And therefore, my current state is just fine because I'm comparing myself to someone who is obviously far less healthy than me. Or you could say, you know what? My body's doing what I need it to do right now, and I am grateful for it, and that's great. And I love that my health is robust enough that I've got that. But I want to work on improving it. Mm-hmm. Okay? I'm going to compare my current self to myself from a year ago.
Yep.
But to compare myself to myself from 20 years ago is not fair. To compare myself to yesterday, tomorrow, that's about that time frame. You don't have forever to just look at this gigantic continuum and say, well, really, I ought to be way up here because that's all I got.
You can't compare yourself to anyone else either. Their situation is different. Their metabolism is different. There's so many things that are different about their situation. And you may have the same dedication and you have the same regimen, but you don't end up looking like that. You don't get the exact same. Why? Because it's a different person. It's a different body. There's no guarantee given the same situation that you're going to look exactly the same. But if we do that comparison and then we're disappointed, You're not bringing into it the reality of it's like it was never going to be a one-to-one comparison.
Well, and the same thing also holds. We're talking about like physique, but you look at like a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk, that these are people who have not only a certain work ethic and a certain ideal about the way that they're going to do things, maybe a certain intelligence level,
Sure.
but also a whole lot of luck at being at the right place at the right time with the right idea that was able to start this gigantic business, and they worked their butts off to make it happen. And we see them now and we say, wow, he's like a billionaire. That's amazing.
Yeah, and then we compare it to us.
It is amazing, but it's also not feasible for everybody to have that situation.
And so then when we compare it to us, it's like, I'm such a loser because look where they're at, and I'm like 10 years older than they are, and I'm struggling to make ends meet. Well, that's not fair. It's not fair to yourself. You weren't given the same situation. You weren't given the same resources. That doesn't mean that you should now look at them with ire and be like, I hate you, terrible person. It's not that. It's just realize the situation that you're in, do what you can to make things better for yourself, and don't compare it to the impossible of perfection, because it doesn't exist.
Well, and there's that other old adage that comparison is the thief of joy.
I had not heard that.
If you're always comparing yourself to someone else who's better off, you will always find someone who is better off. That's just the nature of life. You're always going to find that bigger fish or that thing that's just a little better or a little cooler than what you've got. Maybe you have the cool new hotness. You just got your brand new iPhone the moment it came out. But the next year there's going to be another one. Do you always chase that? Maybe that's a thing that's important to you, is to always have that latest thing, and that's a metric that you use. Fair enough. I'm not trying to tell you that that's the end of the world if you do that. But
Right.
if you hang on to it for an extra year, what else could you do with that? Compared to what?
If we're constantly looking for justification for our life through outside sources, right? If I'm comparing where I'm at now to where Bob Smith is at this time, I'm going to be disappointed because maybe Bob Smith just had started earlier, right? I look at myself, I'm going to be 52 here in a week or two. And a lot of the developers and stuff that I work with at my current company are younger, a lot younger. Some are around the same age, but some of them are a lot younger. And they got started younger because they, right out of high school, they knew exactly what they wanted to do. I didn't do that, right? I went in the military and did other things, and eventually I got to the point where I got into IT much later in life. Now, if I was going to beat myself up and compare myself, well, I could have been this person by now on that same trade had I done exactly what they had done. Well, that wasn't something that was meant for me at that point in time, and I have to take that in stride.
And it may be true that, okay, well, yeah, if I had made different choices, my life would be different. Okay. And then what?
Would you have been happy if you were in that position now, or would you be comparing yourself to the CEO? Like, oh, man, he's the CEO. He's only 2 years older than me, man. I'm so terrible person. I don't know. Measure yourself against yourself, as you just stated. Okay, I want to be a thing. I want to do a thing. Okay, I'm going to start down that process. And then a week from now, 2 weeks from now, 1 month from now, half a year from now, I can now reflect and say, where am I along the pathway? Am I better off where I was? Am I making progress? Yes. Find contentment in that you're able to motivate yourself and follow through.
Changing gears here.
Okay.
Another way in which compared to what can operate in our lives is when we're looking at our options that are in front of us. Mm-hmm. So recently took my kids out of the school that they were in and we changed schools.
Okay.
And we have that kind of educational freedom around here, so we were able to make this change. We had to stop and do this process of figuring this out, and it all came down to compared to what? The current school that they were at, or the old school they were at, was okay. It was meeting the most basic educational needs, and it kept the kids busy all day. They had a couple of friends here and there. There were a couple of little problems here and there, but it was okay. Compared to what? Well, we've had some friends that were going to a different school, and they invited us to I think it was a choir concert, or there was a play that they were doing, something like that. And we got to see what they were doing at that place, and we were saying, oh, wow, this is an opportunity that I want for my kids. Is this something that's feasible for us? Does it make sense for us to do? So we did a big comparison of school A to school B, and that's it.
Right.
In that situation, we can't compare, okay, well, in a perfect world, the school would be a little closer, and this one would be a little bit over here, and this one would have this option,
But you're comparing it to something that doesn't exist.
and so if we make the comparison truthfully, based on real things and real known information, we did the research on it. We went and took a tour of the new school, and we got their packet, and we talked to, it was the weirdest thing. We got an opportunity to actually talk to some of the students, because as we were going around on the tour guide would be like, hey, how's it going? And the kid would be like, hey, oh, are you taking a tour, considering going here? This place is awesome. We love this teacher. She is amazing at orchestra or whatever. Oh, they have an orchestra program. That's cool. There's more options at school B, so we ended up choosing school B, feeling like that was the best choice after much discussion and deliberation. When we're making any kind of decision, we have to compare it to realistic options.
And now, on that note, I'm going to be slightly controversial here.
Ooh.
Slightly. And that's in the relationships, right? There are statistics that are out there now that indicate that, birth rates are down. I think in the United States, like per the normal, family, it's only like 1 point some odd kids per household, when it used to be like 2 point something. And
Below replacement birth rate.
yes, and I think the replacement birth rate is like 2.1 something kids per household in order to be able to replace the existing populace, right? But the United States is now well below that, and so are a lot of other countries. And one of the factors, not the only factor, but one of the factors is the current expectations of what we expect from a partner, right? From both men's side and the women's side. So I'm not singling out a particular gender here, but the expectation that from the men's side, I need to have somebody who looks top-notch model, and they got to have to bring so much to the table, terminology that's used at that time.
Sure.
Right. And then from the women's side, it's, they have to be a certain height, and they have to have a certain wealth, and they have to have certain status in their life. And then they got to be able to take care of me, but they also have to not interfere with what I want to do because I'm an independent woman, but they still got to provide. Again, I'm not knocking a particular side, but this is like the common mindset right now. I had the conversation with my daughter and son-in-law. There was a woman who shot down a guy who asked her for her number, and she said, basically, I'm not interested. The guy got upset, went over and grabbed a brick and threw a brick at her.
Youch.
Yeah. Now, of course, we already know that's inappropriate behavior. But she said,
Ever.
Beyond that, nobody there, especially the guys that were there, did anything to stop the guy, to stop him from doing it. And I brought up the whole issue with Seinfeld, that last episode of Seinfeld, where they were the bystander and they kept making fun of the guy who got hurt or something of that nature, and they all got arrested. Because the mindset has changed, right? This mindset change of what is my responsibility as a citizen or as a man or as a woman, and that's changed. And I realize I'm going on a tangent here, but the point I'm trying to bring up is that the mentality has changed. And so when we decide that we want to look for somebody who is going to be an ideal spouse or ideal partner, we don't compare it to what's realistic. We compare it to what is idealistic. And the ideal man is all these things, and the ideal woman is all these things. And so when somebody comes in at you and they're showing you an interest because they're attracted to you, they like who you are as a person, and your immediate response is to shoot them down and to say, nope, you don't have a chance in Hades because even though you're here, you're not here, and you're unacceptable. Anything below this is unacceptable. We're not being realistic in that particular case. Go back to Brad Pitt. If the ideal man or spouse for you is Brad Pitt, well, guess what? There's only one of him.
And odds are you're probably not going to meet him.
Or have the opportunity to. And if you become a stan, as it's called, a stalker fan, stan, if you become a stan, you're definitely never going to have an opportunity to get with him, right? It's just the way that it works. So I'm not saying to lower your expectations, but what I'm saying is do fair analysis and comparisons to what is actually acceptable in a partner, right? have that a little bit of that mindset and know that, okay, I know that there are only a limited amount of people in this country, whether it's the United States or wherever country they're at, is going to meet my ideal expectations. What is the probability of me getting that? Probably next to none. Not impossible, but highly improbable.
And I think this is where we can learn something from quality control processes.
Sure.
This is something from business school that I'm pulling out from the Wayback Machine here. That talking about, there's a big deal several years ago, the idea of what they called Six Sigma quality.
Okay.
This whole thing basically comes down to statistics, standard deviations. You do a bell curve, and then you've got one standard deviation from the mean is, I forget, something in the neighborhood of 60 to 70% of your population, whatever it is going to be within that, because that's how averaging a bell curve works statistically. Right. Then you go out one more, and you've captured another 15 to 20%. And then you go out one more standard deviation, and that goes both sides of the mean. You've captured 97% of whatever the population is that you're looking at, whether it's widgets or people or whatever.
Right.
And so all you have at that point is the long tail. You have the outliers on either side. Now, moving an additional standard deviation only gets you like maybe another percent. It's really, really difficult to keep moving, beyond that.
Right.
So what you end up with is in business, there's a certain concept of tolerances, right? I worked for an accounting department and was dealing with financial statements, and it's within the generally accepted accounting principles. That's a real specific abbreviation that if you work in accounting, they just call it GAAP, GAAP. So the idea is there's a threshold of materiality that if you're dealing with complex financial statements, and there's a lot of information on there, they will often leave off anything that's below the 1,000 mark.
Yep.
And so all the numbers are in thousands, period. They don't even show on the statement if it's below the 1,000.
Okay.
And then if there was a variance, a problem, there was something missing or something didn't balance or add up, if it was less than $5,000, they said, don't even bother. We'll find it. We'll find it sometime if it becomes material.
Right.
So again, looking at these things where you can say, well, it's got to be perfect. Okay. Well, the 80-20 rule, the Pareto principle says that you're going to spend 20% of your time doing 80% of the work.
Yep.
And then to get that last 20% right is going to take you 80% of the time on the project just to finish the thing. Right. But you can get the bones stood up quick.
Yeah.
Well, that's how a lot of this stuff is when we make these comparisons. If we're trying to get that last 1%, Netflix has famously been offering this prize that if you can increase their algorithm accuracy of suggestions by like 1%, or I think now they're at like 0.5%, they'll give you $1 million. Because when you get to that level, the tiniest little tweak is now worth infinitely more than the last incremental amount.
Yeah. So
when we're making our choices and our decisions, we're doing our research, we're trying to figure out, what am I going to do with this? What am I going to do with that? I'm looking at for a successful relationship, a life partner. Am I going to hold out for perfection? Well, to get that extra 1%, that's going to be that much harder to find, because now you're looking at the statistical population of every available human being on the planet.
Right.
And the ones that meet that perfect are only way, way out there at the one trailing end on the good side.
Yeah.
That's very, very rare to get that level of awesomeness. Now, compatibility isn't about perfection, because there's also that part where you look in the mirror and you say, well, I'm not perfect either.
Right.
And what you really need is that someone who's going to be with you and is going to be willing to help you work through whatever you've got and overlook some stuff and forgive some stuff, and you're going to work on things together.
Yep. I think, as Jordan Peterson has stated, is that you have two people that have dedicated themselves to working to the same goal or similar goals. That's what you want, right? The point I was going to bring up is from the retail business, whenever you're doing projections, what do you think you're going to do in sales for the next week? Well, if the week that you were coming out of was a holiday, like Thanksgiving or something of that nature, where the sales are phenomenally out of whack because everyone's going to the store and everyone's buying a bunch of stuff they think they might need. Well, you obviously cannot use that as a determinant of what next week's sales are going to be. Why?
Right.
Because that's an outlier, right? That's a rarity. It happened once a year. That it gets crazy for that week, but we don't include that in projections for future sales. Why? Because the norms were not being followed. So if your expectation is next week's going to be spectacular, just like last week was, and then when you become abysmally short of that sales dollars and you don't know why, then you're not being realistic in your comparisons. And there's going to be times in our lives we may have had an opportunity or a relationship that was phenomenal and it didn't last for one reason or another. It didn't continue on. And now you're trying to move on. But if everything you juxtapose going forward that's similar in your life into that one awesome thing that was the outlier, I'm not saying don't be hopeful, but what I am saying is be realistic. And know that if I ever get the opportunity for this thing to happen again, I'm going to do my best to maintain it. But there's a probability that it won't be. But it's compared to what I would normally expect, normally want in a realistic sense. Does it meet most of that criteria? Okay, then it's doable. It's something I can work with.
So in summary, it's not fair to hold yourself or others to unrealistic standards. Every time that we're making a comparison, we have to say, compared to what?
And it's okay to have goals. It's okay to have some standards that you want to try to reach as best as you can. But know that we don't live in a perfect world and none of us are perfect. Except that a realistic goal can be and prove to be fruitful.
Thanks for joining us on WizNugs. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for joining us today on WizNugs. If you liked what you heard, spread the word. For more information, head over to myWizNugs.com.